Well, first of all, I'd like to thank everyone who is listening for joining us on this first of a series, webinar series on board quality and the impact of relevant industry experience on members of the board, and in particular for non-executive members of the board. I know that for many of our participants, proxy season is starting to get rolling in Australia, so we very much thank you for taking the time to participate. Before we begin, there are two technical logistical aspects that need to be addressed. First of all is that if you want to hide the prompter from GoToWebinar, you can actually do so by clicking on this icon, and that will minimize it to a manageable size that you can move, so you can more properly see the presentation. And the second is that as an attendee, if you have a question, in this same screen, you can ask a question at the bottom, which will then be routed to myself and to Werner, who is part of the marketing team. And we will address these after towards the end of the presentation with a small Q&A section. Okay? So first of all, I'd like to go over the agenda of what we're going to be covering. I'd also like to take some time to introduce myself as well as our two external speakers. My name is Jonathan Nelson. I'm a manager in the corporate governance department here at Sustainalytics. It's a relatively new department that was founded in January of 2015. The corporate governance team offers a modular product to that of the regular ESG research that Sustainalytics produces. There's much overlap between the two research products, as the G pillar of ESG is being integrated with our corporate governance data. I've worked with Sustainalytics since July of 2015. Before joining the company, I actually worked at Institutional Shareholder Services, which I believe is a company that many of our listeners is familiar with, working in the custom research division. In my capacity there, I helped institutional investors implement their custom voting policies in their portfolio companies. Don't let my accent fool you. I am indeed from North America, from the United States. I started out working with ISS in Rockville, Maryland, working mainly with investors in the Northeast Corridor. After 3.5 years, I transferred to Brussels, Belgium, where I worked mainly with French investors and helping them implement their unique perspective on governance in their own portfolios. We also have Karin Halliday, and Ed John, and I think they can introduce themselves now.
Okay, hi, I'm Karin Halliday from AMP Capital. I've been at AMP Capital for all of my career, so almost 30 years, 10 years in portfolio management, and since 2000 I've been responsible for corporate governance and proxy voting. So I engage with the companies that we invest in on behalf of our clients and execute their voting across all our different mandates, particularly focusing on Australia. Thank you.
Ed, would you like to say a word about yourself?
Sorry about that, I was just struggling with the mute button there. Thanks, my name is Ed John. I'm the Executive Manager focused on governance, engagement, so issues like proxy voting and ESG research at the Australian Council of Superannuation Investors. The short form of that is ACSI. I guess compared to Karen's 30 years in this area, I'm a relative babe in the woods. I've been working close to 10 years, doing a lot of engagement and research on Australian boards, specifically ASX 300 companies. In terms of ACSI's mandate, we work sort of for and on behalf of 35 superannuation and pension funds, doing research, engagement with companies and regulatory engagement, and our 35 member funds invest close to $1.3 trillion.
Okay, thank you both, Karin and Ed, for that brief introduction. I can go ahead with the agenda of what we'll be covering in today's webinar. First of all, I'll be giving a brief introduction to Sustainalytics. I know that there have been recent outreach efforts in the region, so that you may be familiar with our name, but just for those listeners for whose this is their first time encountering our company, I will also give a brief overview of the company's corporate governance product and the areas that we cover, focusing in on really two main questions. Then I'll give a brief methodology review for the study that was conducted using the data that's been collected by our team over the past year. I will then dig into that data, basically first beginning with a sector level analysis, so analyzing the level of relevant industry experience by sector. Then I will dig into the same issue by region. Now, throughout the sector and the regional analysis, we will be pairing it with another data point that our team collects, and that is an evaluation of the company's nomination process, so that we can see if there is a correlation between the level of disclosure that a company gives about the nomination process for directors and the level of experience on the board. Okay, and then for the end, after I've finished with this part of the presentation, Karin and Ed will both kind of give a brief rundown on how they use this type of information in their daily functions, both as investment research, proxy voting, and engagement. That will be followed by a brief question and answer, during which time we can hopefully address some of your questions. If you do have a question to address to someone in particular, we ask that you frame it in the function that I just showed you earlier, so that we can respond more appropriately. Okay, so let's get started. So Sustainalytics is a ESG and corporate governance research firm that helps investors implement their responsible investment strategies. We were named overall best independent ESG research firm 3 times over the last 4 years. We also have a global footprint. For the speakers, or for the participants of this webinar, the most relevant regional offices are in Sydney and in Tokyo, with the Singapore office slowly winding down. The research hubs are actually in both Toronto, Canada, Amsterdam, the Netherlands, where I am currently located, as well as several smaller research operations throughout Europe. We have 300 plus professional staff, and more than half of whom are engaged in research. We like to call ourselves a micro multinational, as we have this extended global footprint. So for the corporate governance offering, this is a modular offering in addition to the regular ESG research that Sustainalytics is known for. We analyze companies along 6 pillars. And these pillars, the core of each of these pillars is that we ask fundamental questions about the company's overall governance structure. The corporate governance research is more along the lines of a ratings and in-depth corporate governance profile. We do not provide proxy vote recommendations, although the research that we provide can be used in tandem with a proxy advisor and research that they provide. The main focus is towards helping investors have a more in-depth understanding along these 6 pillars for every company in their portfolio. We apply these 6 pillars to every company that we analyze, but we also take into account local market norms and standards in our final evaluation, which does lead to a comparable set of data across the entire universe that we cover. So for our purposes, the first question that we ask is board management quality integrity. What kind of perspectives are on the board? What kind of industry experience is present on the board? And how can that influence an eventual discussion around management's agenda? The second pillar looks at the board structure, and the question that we ask here is, now that we know what kind of perspectives are present, who controls the discussion? Is the CEO chair combined? Do regional variations in corporate governance standards prevent the combination of such roles? And who is leading these discussions? For the third pillar, which is the ownership and shareholder rights, we look at is there a controlling shareholder? If so, what are the rights for minority shareholders that the company has put into place, and how can that impact your investment in the company? For the remuneration structure, we look at, has the company made comprehensive disclosure? And if disclosure is available, how can investors evaluate the remuneration practices in a way that aligns the goals of management with those of their stated business goals? For our fifth pillar, we look at the financial reporting oversight mechanisms. And the first question we ask is, actually, is there someone on the audit committee or the equivalent body in that market who has financial expertise and who can provide that level of in-depth expertise that's necessary for large publicly listed companies? And for the sixth pillar, we look at the ESG stakeholder governance. How is the company's governance structure presented in a way that addresses ESG issues, keeping with the broader organizational mandate of Sustainalytics, which is to create a more just and equitable global economy. For the methodology that we used in our research, our total universe of companies was 3,869 individual listed entities. Now, this covers the vast majority of the MSCI emerging markets and developed markets indices, and also takes into account the many of the local principal indices for the markets in question, such as the ASX 200, the DAX 30, the CAC 40 in France, and the S&P 500 in the United States. As I mentioned briefly earlier, the first pillar of Sustainalytics corporate governance research, we asked two fundamental questions. And these questions are centered around the level of relevant industry experience brought to the board. The first question we ask is there a member of the board, a non-executive member of the board, because all these questions are focused towards the non-executives, who has outside experience as a non-executive director within the same industry, looking for the ability of this director to provide relevant industry insights from a public company perspective, because the operational needs of a public company are very different from that of a private company. We do not take into account private companies, first of all, because the ability to verify the information is a bit more scattershot. Publicly listed companies have very well regulated disclosure regimes, and so it's much easier to verify this information. The second question we ask is there a non-executive member of the board who has experience as an executive at an outside company within the relevant industry? And this executive experience, however, can come through either private or from private companies or through a public company. And the core of the issue that we're looking for here is whether there's an individual on the board who can provide operational oversight for the sector or the industry in question. So what is our definition of relevant industry experience? We try to have a multidimensional approach. So we look for whether or not the companies on which the individual has served is within a parallel company within the same industry directly. So pharmaceutical companies working for Eli Lilly versus working for AstraZeneca. We also look at what we call ancillary experience. And this is within industries that are essential for the company's production or for the company's operations. To give a more local example for the audience that I'm speaking to, Woolworths, for example, there are no members of the board of directors as of February of last year. There are no members of the boards of directors of Woolworths who have experience sitting on the boards of similar food retail companies. However, they do have several members of the board that sit on food production companies, such as Nestle or Coca-Cola, and as these are products that are sold within supermarkets, the supply chains and the logistics necessary are similar, and so we count this experience as being relevant industry experience. We also look for industries that utilize the company's output. To give you an example of an oil company, if there is a member of the board of Total, for example, Total SA, the French oil giant, who also serves on the board of a refinery company, this would count because the oil that's produced by Total eventually will make its way to a refinery and eventually into the consumer supply chain. For the second pillar, the second question that we're going to ask throughout this presentation basically comes from the second pillar of research. So looking at the board structure, we examine how the nomination committee is set up, and we also look at the company's level of disclosure on the nominating process itself. We more or less have two definitions for the nominating process and the quality of the nomination process disclosure. there's either minimal disclosure or no disclosure at all. So the company either says nothing about it in its annual report or most recent disclosure documents, or the process is extremely well disclosed in that there's a discussion of what exact factors the board looks at, the composition of the board and how it correlates with those factors, and potential gaps in the board's current composition that would lead to an examination of future candidates within this framework. This is typically called a skills matrix or skills gap matrix. And just to give you an idea of the sectors that we analyze, we use sectors that had a minimum of 50 companies analyzed throughout our universe, and this is so that we do not skew the results as expressed in percentage with companies that have, or with sectors that only have eight companies in 50% or 4 companies. It would give a proportionally incorrect impression on a global level. We also analyze, and for this sector, the sector breakdown, we use the S&P first sector classification, which led to 68 sectors in total. So as I go through the findings so far, I'm going to more or less break down, I will go through first the level of outside non-executive experience brought to boards in these sectors. I will give the top 10, and I will also give the bottom 10. For the sectors that we've analyzed. I will then proceed for the outside executive experience for the sectors in question, following the same format as top 10 and bottom 10. Then we will look at the nomination process as well as any potential overlaps for the non-executive director experience and the executive experience, so that we can see if there are certain sectors which have higher levels overall. As you can see from this first slide, the relevant industry experience by sector for outside non-executive directors, the top 10 is led by the pack by a fairly wide margin by energy, equipment, and services, which I believe is linked to the oil, gas, and consumable fuel, the high level seen at oil, gas, and consumable fuels. Followed next by semiconductors and semiconductor equipment and software. This goes back into, I believe, as I expressed earlier, the linking of certain industries with both input and output experience. So chances are that someone who working at a software company will definitely have made use in their product, in the production cycle, of semiconductors and semiconductor equipment. And the same goes for the oil, gas, and consumable fuels. They will definitely have made use of the energy, equipment, and services companies within that particular sector. For the bottom 10, we see what are potentially some surprising results. First of all, being that pharmaceuticals, the pharmaceutical industry falls within the bottom 10 for outside non-executive experience. Food and staples retailing potentially also falling in line with the reference to Woolworths earlier. Chemicals and then auto components having the lowest level, with only 43% of companies having any outside non-executive directors with similar industry experience. So now I'll proceed to the executive experience with the top 10 and the bottom 10. And some of these names may look familiar. Some of these sectors may look familiar. We have, once again, energy, equipment, and services leading the pack, although oil and gas is a little bit lower than with non-executive outside experience. The insurance sector comes in second. And it looks, however, like we have a new addition to the top 10, and that is banks. And let's put pen number 1 in that. We can come back to it a little bit later to potentially explain why banks have fallen to the top 10 for executive experience, but not the top 10 for non-executive outside experience. So for the bottom 10 for executive experience, there's great overlap between what we saw for non-executive outside experience. Once again, auto components is the bottom of the pack. Well, auto components, textiles, apparel, and luxury goods are at the bottom of the pack. Food, staples, and retailing, hotels, restaurants, and leisure, etc. So if we look at the overlap between those sectors, at the top 10, we see that almost 9 of the 10 share common features with the very highest levels of industry level experience, both as non-executive outsiders and as outside executives. And as I mentioned earlier, banks falls into the top 10 for executive experience. And I believe that there have been several studies that may lead to some potential ideas about why this is the case. One study showed that boards of banks are much less amenable to actually providing what is very sensitive business strategy information, such as the content of the discussions of the board of directors, to outsiders who could potentially leak such information to competitors. So for the bottom 10, we see once again that there is significant overlap between the food products, food retail, pharmaceuticals. For non-executive experience who do not share being at the bottom with executive experience, we have construction and engineering, chemicals, and REITs. On the flip side of REITs, for having low levels of executive experience, we have real estate management, electric utilities, and specialty retail. So for a brief examination on sector level for both non-executive outside experience as well as the executive experience, we want to take a deeper dive into the nomination process by sector. And as I mentioned earlier, our definition of having a well-disclosed nomination process includes an in-depth discussion of the current composition of the board, the needs of the board in order for the company to meet its stated business goals, as well as potential gaps in the current board composition. As we see once again, energy, equipment, and services more or less leads the pack for having a very well-disclosed nomination process. Oil, gas, and consumables falls a little bit behind from the trend that we saw earlier. Commercial services and supplies is a new player in the sectors that we've seen so far. And the chemicals, also as we identified earlier, has typically low levels of non-executive outside experience. And banks do not appear to fall into the top 10 either. So once again, looking at the overlap between the nomination process and the outside experience, we can see that oil, gas, metals and mining, insurance, industry equipment, diversified telecommunication both have a very high level of nomination disclosure as well as a very high level of outside experience. The most surprising finding that I've seen so far is that the pharmaceutical industry, while having an extremely high level of nomination disclosure, has a fairly low level of outside experience being brought into play. But this may also be linked to the overall reticence on the behalf of board members to bring in people with outside board experience for trade secret purposes. So now that we've examined the level of industry experience by sector, I will follow a similar format, but by region. As we know, corporate governance is more or less a jurisdictional dependent field. This means that the country of incorporation or the country of listing determines the corporate governance standards that a company is bound to follow. And so we will hopefully find some tendencies as well as correlations between the region and the level of experience and the level of disclosure, just like we did by sector level. As you can see, for outside non-executive experience, this is the overall leader of the pack, would be Brazil. This is a bit of a pin number 2. Let's put a pin in that, and we can come back to that a little bit later towards the end of the discussion to potentially identify some discrepancies and explain them. So coming into play in the definition of an outside director is also heavily dependent on the company's capital breakdown as well as the structure of the groups in which they're involved. Our research does not take into account experience gained at companies within the same group unless they are held by less than 50% of the main controlling entity and are listed themselves. North America coming in second place, followed by Australia and New Zealand, then the United Kingdom, Hong Kong, and then Western Europe, with everyone else falling below 70% with no outside non-executive experience. Moving on to the executive level of experience, we find that actually Western Europe is the #1 region, with more than 82% of companies having some member of the board with outside executive experience, then followed by North America, and then Eastern Europe and the United Kingdom, which come into close finish for a tie for third place, which is another surprising aspect. Followed again by Brazil. So to get down to what everyone, I believe most of the participants really want to know, is what is the percentage of companies by region that have no outside industry experience? Now this includes experience as non-executives, outside non-executives, as well as outside executives. And by far, I would say #1, but I don't know how that would correlate to being #1. If you have fewest, would be South Korea with 66.96%, followed by Japan with 56.04%. This also comes back to the point that I made earlier about companies within groups and their experience not counting, as we know that the chaebol structure in South Korea, as well as with the keiretsu structure in Japan, leads to the fact that many executives and non-members of the boards of subsidiary companies are counted as outsiders, but their experience in our evaluation does not go into that calculation. Western Europe, United Kingdom with the lowest percentages, North America with the absolute lowest, Brazil, once again pen #2 for Brazil, and Australia and New Zealand being tied with Eastern Europe. This is also heavily dependent on the number of companies that we've analyzed. North America having the largest number of companies from our universe, having about a quarter, or about 1,000 companies that we've analyzed out of the approximately 4,000 so far. Brazil had 68, Australia and New Zealand had 217, and Western Europe had about 500. So looking at the nomination process by region and remembering the definition of what a well-disclosed nomination process is, we see that, as will potentially make many of the participants at this webinar fairly happy, Australia and New Zealand comes well in advance of any of the other contenders, with 30.456% of the companies analyzed having extremely well-disclosed nomination process. This is followed by Western Europe, and then North America, with many of the others falling below 10%. And pen #2 again, Brazil. Brazil having some of the highest levels of executive and non-executive director experience, but then having no companies having a well-disclosed nomination procedure. So looking at the breakdown by market and through the nomination process, we can see that I think that in most of the corporate governance professionals' experience who've seen companies on a global level, there are no surprises that there are high levels of experience and an in-depth nomination disclosure in 4 of these regions, principally being Australia, New Zealand, North America, Western Europe, and the United Kingdom. On the flip side of having the no surprises, we have low experience and low disclosure of the nomination process, particularly in Japan and South Korea, once again due to the equity ownership structure within the large groups that are part of the corporate governance and the business structure within those countries. Although back to pen #2, we see that Brazil has high levels of industry experience both on the non-executive and executive level, but zero disclosure of the nomination process. This potentially as well has to do with the definition of a group, as well as what I call labyrinthine ownership structure of many Brazilian companies, where the group is funneled through nonprofit entities, potentially obscuring and obfuscating the definition of what an outside director is. Okay, so that more or less, in a nutshell, or a coconut shell, as some people, as I've heard said, is the bulk of the findings that we've had so far. So as you can see that on the sector level, somewhat surprisingly, the breakdown of the nomination process corresponds more or less on a sector level, but that kind of bifurcates into both having very high levels of experience as well as very low levels of experience. The nomination process is typically dictated by local market standards. As we look throughout the breakdown by market of the nomination process and the level of experience. And I would go further and conject that actually the sector level, correlation with sector level and nomination process is also dependent upon the market in which these sectors, the companies in these sectors are incorporated or listed. So using that as a starting point, I think we can engage the external speakers at this point. Karin, I know that you wanted to speak a little bit to our audience about what exactly you look for in the board composition and the influence that might potentially have on risk management.
Okay, yeah, I'm happy to do that. Okay, so I've been asked to provide an investment manager's perspective on this issue, and remembering that I've got an equity background and a governance background, so that's where my comments will be coming from. And, you know, looking at it from a really high level, investment management is about allocating capital to opportunities that will create an attractive return for the risk that investors take. And so, you know, we've got to remember that that's what we're doing. And so when you look at the value of companies, the market cap of them is often quite different to the value of assets on the balance sheet. And that is because a lot of the value resides in intangibles and those hard to measure aspects of a company, things like brand, reputation, quality of its people, staff engagement, innovation, risk management, culture. All those things drive value. And so if value is driven by those intangibles, it's important to ask what drives the intangibles. And I'd argue that that often comes down to company leadership and the quality of the board and management. And for that reason, looking at board composition is very important to investors. And also boards have a really important role to play. They have a large range of legal responsibilities, but they also are responsible for setting the strategic direction of the company. They appoint the CEO and the CFO. They organise the pay arrangements for those executives. They monitor performance and the management team and the business. They approve the company's risk appetite. They monitor the risk management policies, oversee the risk culture, and generally oversee the governance of the organisation as a whole. So you can see that the board has quite a lot of responsibilities in driving the value of companies. And given that, the quality of the board advice and the oversight depends on the information that the board has, but also on their ability to process the information that they get. And so that then brings us to the specific issue of board composition. So you've got directors with particular information, and how equipped and how effective are they at processing that information and making decisions on behalf of shareholders. So it's important to look at the skills, the traits, the experience, and what is needed to put the board in the best position to execute all those responsibilities on behalf of shareholders and other stakeholders like employees and the community, etc. So I'd argue that ideally you've got boards that have diverse backgrounds, each bringing valuable skills and experience so that they can oversee the strategy and so that they can manage the risks. And I know that's a lot of words, but if you look at some board skills matrices, I looked at the one for our own company, AMP, our parent company. And so what AMP has done, it's listed its strategic objectives. It said, okay, these are the things in 2016 that we want to achieve: leverage key markets, become more efficient, grow internationally, etc. And then it's listed what specific non-executive director skills it needs, and also what general skills it needs. So it's important that boards have specific skills, but also the general skills. And specific skills are things, for our industry, are things like life insurance experience, retail and corporate business experience, digital technologies, funds management, government relations. So not necessarily just having been on a life insurance company board, but it's quite broad, the experience that is relevant for achieving the strategic objectives. And then there's also a whole lot of general experience that is helpful. Things like financial acumen, CEO experience, legal experience, HR, non-executive director experience generally, investment and treasury experience. And then in addition to that, when you look at the composition of a board, it's important to look at the level of independence of those directors, and that's something that we haven't touched on at all in this presentation, but independence is important, and also the diversity of the board and the geographic spread, so that it matches the geographic spread of the businesses with the directors, and then also things like succession planning. So in terms of board composition, there's specific skills are important, general skills are important, and then it also comes down to the nature of these directors, whether they have the education, the character, the diligence, the honesty, integrity, judgment, and sufficient time to execute to fulfil their obligations. So it's not a one-size-fits-all that these are the skills that you need. It's quite a broad range of skills that we would assess when looking at the quality of a board. And then these factors, or these qualifications or criteria, then give the board the ability to manage the risks of the company, whether that's strategic risks, financial risks, product risks, operational risks, whatever those risks are. Having the broad skills helps address those particular issues. And back to where I started talking about the importance of intangible factors, I think it's important to look at how innovative the board is and how they focus on culture and the people of the organisation as well. So rather than just focus on industry-specific issues, it's important to focus on other sort of more broader issues as well. So industry experience is important, and I think it's something that we certainly look for on boards, but so is independence and diversity. And when I say diversity, I don't just mean gender, but also diversity in tenure, in experience, in background, in ethnicity, and also in the way that directors think. So it's very hard from outside a boardroom to judge whether the directors that are on the board are able to fulfill their duties on our behalf, because you don't get a lot of information in the annual reports or in their bios, and you need to make an assessment of how well that particular group of people are working together and able to solve the current problems of the company. So at AMP Capital, we engage with boards frequently. We have a lot of company chairmen and the chairman of remuneration committees coming in to see us at least on an annual basis, and we're able to ask them questions about diversity, about succession planning, and about independence, and make an assessment of those things. And while statistics like these that Sustainalytics have shown us, while they're handy and a handy starting point, it's important to build a fuller picture. It's important to build a fuller picture of the board skills. So bottom line, we think industry experience is important, and it's certainly been shown to have some benefits, but it's not the only thing that that is important for boards. And we've actually had a look at some studies on industry experience and what it adds, and it adds a deeper understanding of the risks and opportunities, but it also, having directors on a board that have industry experience, it gives the CEO more connections to different people in the industry, and it also provides the company with a better understanding of the regulatory environment, and it makes it easier for the board probably to make decisions when they're quite complex because they've got a lot of given knowledge already. Having said that, if you've got directors on the board that have industry experience, there is a risk that an inexperienced CEO might rely on that, or that other directors might rely on that particular director's experience and not challenge the status quo, which is quite dangerous. And the risk of inertia is always a problem when you've got people that have done things a certain way for a long time and are seen as the experts and people not wanting to challenge them. It's been shown that industry outsiders quite often recognise disruption and see new ideas much more than people that have been involved in the industry for a very long time. So I think I should leave it there, and I'll hand over to Ed, who's got some specific comments on how you assess industry experience and what that looks like. So I'm happy to answer questions at the end. Thank you.
Fantastic. That was a really great overview, Karin, and there are probably some points I'll raise which may sort of double up, but I think that background of why this issue of industry experience on boards was really well articulated there. I mean, one way, I personally and ACSI as an organisation look at the issue of industry experience. I think, again, having the skills or having non-executives on boards who have been within the relevant industry and sort of generally more than one of those directors is a key factor when we're assessing boards. And if you think about, for instance, the accounts of an insurance company or the operation of an underwriting business, I mean, kind of good luck if you're an outsider, again, chairing that audit committee or trying to, or a board of industry outsiders, trying to really adequately assess those companies. And it's not just a theoretical discussion. I mean, in the Australian market, we've had a couple of very high-profile cases. Again, they're some years ago, but in the early 2000s, the experience of the National Australia Bank, you effectively had a governance meltdown in that company. And one of the key issues which investors were left looking at was the fact that you didn't actually have any non-executives on the board with banking experience at the time. And it was actually a similar issue with the media company Fairfax, again in the mid-2000s, where very large strategic issues happening within the company, big issues on the board. And when you looked around the table, there's actually no media experience among non-executive directors. And I think, again, the Sustainalytics research is welcome, because I think in too many of those instances, it's not until the kind of governance collapses have happened or companies are in flames that you then look into those issues and say, hold on a minute, we actually didn't have anyone from that industry on the board asking the right questions or again, tracking the right risk issues that Karin outlined. Again, I think the issue of relevant experience is a notoriously difficult concept, and I think Jonathan spoke to that. I think certainly welcome this report in a way as the start of a conversation, but I think it's really incumbent on investors to work on that individual analysis. I mean, it is hard looking at individuals' backgrounds where they've been involved in, say, private companies, so not only listed but private companies, and trying to almost categorise an individual director. If someone's worked across, say, banking, law, finance, other areas, so trying to pick out which piece of someone's career is relevant to the specific board. I'd have to say in the Australian market, directors joining boards who don't have non-executive experience on other industry boards is not a concern, so I wasn't surprised by that statistic that it's only around about 10% of boards have that issue. And partly that's a numbers game, so we don't see non-executive directors sitting on competitor companies, so you wouldn't see a director sitting on 2 bank boards. And it's also highly unlikely that someone would sort of move from one bank board to another, and that sort of loyalty issue, as well as the age issue, I think comes to play, given that most non-executive directors would sort of retain those roles for 10 years. So the fact that somebody doesn't have non-executive experience, within the industry isn't such a concern, but I would say that the executive experience is a critical issue. I think I really also welcome Jonathan's analysis about the exercise, is not around ticking boxes. So I think gone are the days where people looked at boards and, had that kind of list of issues to say, do we have one lawyer, one accountant, one ex-CEO, butcher, baker, candlestick maker, that type of tick the box approach. I think it really does come down to the individual company and again the relevant experience, and there's no perfect perfect list of issues that each board must subscribe to. So how do you kind of get in or dig deeper on these issues? I think part of it's the disclosures which are out there, which again Jonathan's captured, and then I'd say the other side is company engagement. So I mean, touching on that issue of disclosure, in the Australian market, the ACSI Corporate Governance Council brought in a requirement, or an if not, why not requirement, for companies to disclose a skills matrix. There's a report out from KPMG earlier this year that actually talks about the fact that I think it's 95% of boards, but quite a large sample, have actually disclosed those, and I think 95% sort of listed the relevant industry, sort of executive industry experience as a key factor. And so, I mean, to my mind, things like disclosures of skills matrices are a useful insight, but really they're the start of the conversation, because they're useful in that they show you the strategic issues that boards are trying to address, and give you that insight into the diversity, and I think, as Karin alluded to, but both issues like gender diversity, skills diversity, age, geographic, and other factors. They actually give you a window into those, or start a good conversation on those. But really, that steps into the realm of engagement. So, I mean, from ACSI's view, we engage with over 130 ASX 200 boards per year. And really, I think when you get to this question of board skills and industry experience, it's very much asking those basic questions about why somebody was appointed, or what, are there skill gaps on the board? What is the board thinking? Because again, 5 to 10 years ago, you really didn't see that in the appointment of directors. Often you just see, a market announcement, somebody's CV or track record. Now very much the conversation, the disclosure is around what that particular person will actually add to the board, and where their sort of strategic experience is relevant. So again, I think they're all important factors, but drawing those out in engagement is a key step. Another factor in the both in the skills matrix and many of the issues Jonathan's touched on is what is relevant industry experience, and we asked this of a lot of boards. So when people talk about retail, they talk about mining, for example. Within a mining, somebody who wants mining experience, does that mean a geologist, an operational expert, someone who's managed a global mining business? There's very different sort of subsets within those categories. So I think, again, drilling down into those, again, it avoids the trap that we saw a lot of boards fall into, where they would say, we would like experience in Asia, without any thought to, which particular market, or which, what type of experience, for instance, within those markets that boards were thinking about. So I mean, there's some high-level thoughts. I think definitely welcome the research, and also I'd be interested to see, so as it's expanded over time, whether there's a link with corporate performance, with governance practices in these companies. Do the boards that don't have relevant industry experience underperform? I mean, I think these are all interesting questions, so welcome the research in that light. I'll leave it there.
Okay, thanks, Ed. Thank you very much. Karin, I think you want to talk a little bit more about the proxy voting and the engagement activities for the hands-on governance activities.
Okay, I can see that we're running out of time, so I just quickly say that when we look at directors, when it's time to vote for AGMs, it is really hard from outside the boardroom to make an assessment of the quality of their contribution to the board, and it's also hard to know exactly what skills they bring to the discussion. So it is something that we look at, but engaging with companies and asking the questions often gives you much more colour on that. And over the years we have tended to vote against directors more on concerns over independence than due to a lack of relevant experience, because it is so much harder to determine the relevance of the experience. Because as I was listening to what Ed was saying, if someone were to point me to an insurance company board, they would think that, they'd say a 30-year career at AMP is, experience in the insurance industry, but my entire career has been in equities investment. So it's hard to look at a person's bio and say, okay, they've got experience because they've worked at X, Y, Z company. They could have done, different or fulfill different roles than you'd expect. So yeah, I'll leave it there because we'll run out of time for questions.
Okay, thank you. If anyone does have any follow-up questions, please, you can email Catalina Secretanu or myself. And we will hopefully be able to address these. Ed and Karin, I would like to thank you both very much for taking the time out of your schedule. Like I said, I know things are starting to heat up down there for you all. And I hope your contributions were extremely informative, both for myself as well as for most of our participants. So thank you once again. Thank you everybody for participating, and we'll hope to hear from you soon.
Thank you.
Yeah.